You're listening to Sports Radio Detroit.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Sports Radio Detroit, the Platte NBA Minute. As always, I'm your host, Chris Platte. I want to thank you all for listening. Hope you all had a great weekend and hope that your week now, as it is Wednesday evening, I hope that your week is going smooth and that everybody is getting excited for Friday. Got some great basketball stuff to talk to, but first, I want to talk about the Sports Radio Detroit annual female personality contest, that is still going on. So please, if you are not aware of it, if you have not participated yet, go to the Sports Radio Detroit website and vote. A link will be in the description of this episode, I'm sure, if not somewhere on the podcast feed itself. So please check that out. Also, you can check it out. I'm sure there's links in the Facebook page as well. So just a quick shout out to promote that and encourage everybody to go vote in that competition. But now let's get to some NBA talk. So last week we did some all NBA stuff and that was fun, but I want to take a break from that this week. I'll kind of circle back to that at the end of the season. But for now, I want to just talk some of the big stuff that happened in the NBA over the last week. First, I'm sorry we have to start on such a dark note, but it is a big topic, and it is Jusuf Nurkic's injury of the Portland Trailblazers. The Portland center has been playing phenomenal this year. He's been one of the best pick-and-roll big men in the game, one of the best divers in the game. He's absolutely huge and essential. He went from being a guy who some people question his contract to now being an absolutely essential third piece to a Portland Trailblazing team, which once again, despite me not believing in them, they still overcame. I'm sorry, I have to admit this right out the way before we even get into the Portland talk that I've been skeptical on them for a minute just because I've just always felt that they're no higher than a first-round playoff team, and I know they've gone past the first round before, but I don't see them. I don't see that. I've never took them as a team that's anything more than that, and which is not a bad thing. It's a great thing. Look, as a Pistons fan, I'd love to be in the playoffs every year and lose in the first round if I could. I would love that. But that's always been kind of my stance on Portland. But to get to the Nurkic injury, it was in a double overtime game against the Nets, and it was a brutal injury. He went up for a rebound. The paint was congested. He came down awkwardly, and he snapped his leg. Had a compound fracture. The pretty much the exact same injury Paul George suffered, but it was on a very routine play. It was on a very just normal play. He was going up for a rebound. It was a little congested, but the paint is always congested, and he came down awkward and snapped his leg, and it was a just very disturbing sight to see. I don't encourage anyone to look up the video. That is only for the strong. I am the weak when it comes to that stuff. But I did see it, and it is extremely disturbing. So first off, thoughts and prayers with him. Portland Trailblazers did update us to say that he had a successful surgery. But the one thing that I couldn't shake from this whole thing was, okay, so we had the Paul George injury. Then fast forward about 4 years, and then we have the Hayward injury. 3 years. Then we have the Hayward injury. And now this year we have the Nurkic injury. And those are all three very similar injuries. Hayward's was an ankle bone, whereas Nurkic and George were compound leg fractures. But still, I just got to wonder why these horrific injuries keep happening. And not to mention the ones in college, like Kevin Ware. Those are just some horrific, terrifying moments. And, as a fan, you just hate to see it. You hate it to happen to anybody. And it's really just, it really has me wondering, like, why do these injuries seem to happen more? Because I don't remember as a kid growing up in the 2000s watching basketball. I don't ever remember it happening in the span of like the 8 or 9 years that I was watching before Paul George's injury. And now we've seen 3 in the last 4 years. And so I'm wondering, is this a trend? Is this just a bunch of abnormal injuries? What's kind of the circumstances of this injury? Like, is this just a totally out the blue thing, or is there something to it? Now, I don't know. I don't have any science to prove it. I don't have any data. I just have those numbers. the fact that I watched it for 9 years and I still don't have and I still don't remember ever seeing something like that. And then now in the last 4 years, I have like 4 or 5 instances, because including the Kevin Ware and stuff. So I don't know. The more I thought about it, the only logical conclusion I can come up with is that the NBA is more athletic and being played at a faster pace, and faster pace means more possessions. More possessions, even though you're playing the same amount of time, more possessions, it will put more wear and tear on your body. That's able to contribute to injury. There's science that has always proved that wear and tear does result in injuries, or can result in injuries, I should say. So that, combined with the fact that just the NBA is so damn athletic now, like everyone on there is a freak of nature athlete, everyone that exists in the NBA, outside of the very small and few people. But for the most part, the NBA is more athletic than it's ever been, more skilled than it's ever been. And so I think that the athleticism and everything is actually kind of a result, a byproduct of that, because playing with all these athletes, if you're not an A-level athlete, which Nurkic isn't, it can put you in awkward positions, and awkward positions is how the Nurkic injury happened. So that's kind of one of the only things I can come up with, and something that kind of really supports that is the fact that I was a couple years ago on my podcast, when I was looking up, I believe it was Steph Curry's injury. I'm not sure which injury it was, but it was a significant injury in the NBA. It wasn't a gruesome injury, but it was a significant injury, and I came across this report from a Utah medical school that showed studies that players are 2.5 times more likely to get injured on a back-to-back. Now this I don't believe. Let me double check. I don't believe it was a back-to-back for Portland. Let me double check on that. But the fact is that it also provided that not only is it back-to-backs highly increase your risk of injury, but also just wear and tear throughout the season. And so that kind of contributes to my thoughts on this injury, and why, the NBA being where it's at and being so fast paced and everything really can result in more injuries. And I hope that this is all wrong, and this is just totally just random anomalies that are happening, and that hopefully this is the last one we ever have to see, because I would be sad if once a year we're faced with this kind of tragic reality. Because even Karis LeVert, when he came down earlier this year, that was a nasty injury. Now, luckily, he was able to make a fast recovery and everything, but that was still a pretty gruesome injury. So some of these injuries have just really been kind of terrifying and shake me up as a sports fan, making me wonder, what do I expect moving forward. I'm trying to look up if it was a back-to-back for Portland. No, it was not a back-to-back for Portland. So that being said, it was not a back-to-back. But I don't know, man. Thoughts and prayers with Nurkic. It's a tough road ahead, man. Being a big man, especially to suffer this kind of injury. Paul George is a wing player. Gordon Hayward is a wing player. So Sean Livingston, when he suffered his injury, was a guard. Kevin Ware was a guard. So I'm really wondering how Nurkic will come back from this. I hope he comes back 100%. I hope he comes back 110%. But we've seen with Hayward this year, just not only is it the physical therapy that's required to bring you back, but there's a lot of trauma that comes with something like that. Something where, it's such a routine play too. I mean, it was even more routine than Paul George. Like Paul George, when that injury happened, the NBA adjusted the rim so that the base was extended back so that wouldn't happen again. So even though, I'm sure every time Paul George went strong to the rack, the first couple times he was thinking about that in his head, but that was something that was able to be regulated out. This was just a routine play that just went horribly, horribly wrong, just like Hayward. And you've seen even with Paul George, it took him 4 years to be what he is now. And you can argue those last 4 years, he wasn't playing nearly as good as he played in previous to that injury, I should say. So, if you're looking at 4 years it takes roughly to get over that mental hurdle, that could be tough, man. That can be really tough. It's why I'm less optimistic on Gordon Hayward than I was to start the season. It's why unfortunately I'm I'm hesitant to be optimistic when it comes to Nurkic. I want to be optimistic, but the just looking at recent history, and that's only one case, so it's hard to go off of that. But this is such an extreme that you have to measure the only similar cases you can find, and that's one of them. So I don't know, man. It's really disheartening. It sucks. This is the worst part about the NBA. It's the worst part about sports. Is just when these horrific injuries happen. Thoughts to Nurkic and his family, and of course the Portland Trailblazers and their fan base. I'm sure this is tough, especially after going through all the injury history that they've gone through with Brandon Roy and why am I blanking? Greg Oden. So they've gone through some tough times in Portland, and my thoughts are with them. That being said, let's talk the basketball side of it. And Portland, this really hurts them bad. It really does to me because he was the one big man. And don't get me wrong, I like Collins. I like Cantor for what he is, for what he's worth. I'm not crazy on him, but I'm not cool. I'm not mad if he plays 10, 12 minutes a game. Like, I'm not mad at that. But now, of course, he's going to be thrusted into a position where he's playing a lot more than that. And, I feel bad because Nurkic is so essential to them because of that screen and roll. Again, they were top five, Damon Nurkic in pick and rolls per game between the two of them. It was a devastating combo. So it was a big part of the Portland Trailblazers offense. And now that offense is missing that is something that's really hard to replace. That is one of the bread and butters of the Portland Trailblazers offense. So to take that away is going to be tough. CJ McCollum's had a down year and an injured year. So combine those two things, Portland is not looking in the best shape at all going into the playoffs. And I know it might be a little bit easy for me to side on the pessimistic side when it comes to Portland, considering that's where I usually reside. But I think just looking at everything that Portland's went through and, where they're currently at with no Nurkic and an injured CJ McCollum, who's even if he comes back now, he's not going to be, I don't know if he'll be in rhythm for the playoffs when the playoffs start. And that's tough. That's a really tough thing to do. And, you're just asking other people like Zach Collins and stuff to make plays and replace Nurkic, and that's just a little bit too tall of a task in my opinion. So let's transition here then, because this kind of sets up the main thought that I had even before the Nurkic injury happened going into this podcast. I wanted to talk about the West because the West is very, very interesting. Now, I have the standings here because the standings change every day, and I don't know if I'm the first to say this because it feels I haven't heard it many places, but all of a sudden to me the Western Conference doesn't. I don't think it's as loaded as we thought. Golden State obviously is Golden State. Denver is a team that's we're going to have to see what that can do. There's real questions on what Jokic can do in the playoffs if his style of game can extend to the playoffs. And so we'll kind of see. We'll have to see that. Houston's been up and down, but they look like probably the second best team in the West, currently fourth right now, tied for third with Portland, but Portland owns the tiebreaker. And, the Clippers, they're a great story. I'm happy for them. They're the fifth seed. I didn't think they would be this high. They're a phenomenal team, and I don't think by any means they're an easy out in the playoffs, but I also don't think that I'm really picking them to win against many teams. And I don't think it's a team that really could even think about threatening Houston, let alone Golden State. And then Utah has been up and down. Just when you think they figured it out, they have a slump. Let's see what they currently are in their last 10. They are currently 7-3, so they're projecting upward because of their 2-game win streaks, their last couple wins. But still at the 6th seed. and just being up and down this year. I don't have a lot of faith in them. Oklahoma City Thunder dropped all the way to the 8th. They now are back in 7th with a half-game lead over San Antonio. San Antonio, after going on a terrible losing streak on their rodeo trip, then they come back and they rip off arguably the most impressive stretch of games in the season, winning against a bunch of top-tier teams. But then now they followed that up with a loss, and now they're back in the 8th seed. So, I mean, honestly, like, really, are we going to get any interesting first round matchups in the West? I really don't know. Because OKC, something's clearly up with that. Russ has tailed off. Schroeder's tailed off. Paul George has tailed off. I think Paul George is not healthy. That's just what I see looking at him. But so OKC seems to be falling apart at the right at the worst time, I should say, the right time for opponents, but the worst time for them. And how many players do they have outside of Schroeder, Russ, and Paul George that can create? The answer is really nothing. Like, they really don't have creators like that. So all three of those players need to be at their absolute best for this team to be really good. And you take those away, like, all of a sudden, like, are you kidding me? Like, you're relying on Jeremy Grant to score, and I like Jeremy Grant a lot. I love him a lot, but I love him when Paul George is being a fucking boss and Russ is killing the game, and Schroeder is just a lightning bottle. That's when I like Jeremy Grant, is when he's playing with those guys, and he doesn't have to create or do anything but just play hard and kind of get those hustle points. And San Antonio, again, they've been up and down all year. Pop is pop, so I'm keeping trust in them. Of the lower half teams of 5 through 8, the Clippers, the Jazz, the Thunder, and the Spurs, I probably trust the Spurs the most. But the Spurs are rolling out a bunch of players who are not really, in the grand scheme of things, considered to be great players. Popovich is just making them great players, and that's awesome. And I love the Spurs for that, and that's what the Spurs do. The Spurs are being the Spurs. That all makes sense to me. But at the end of the day, I mean, they're when they're gonna run into a team like a Denver, like a Houston, like a Golden State, they're just so clearly below that. I mean, maybe they can figure out Houston because they've seemed to have figured out Houston before, so maybe they can do it again. But you see what I'm saying? Like, they're interesting in the fact that you don't know who's gonna win, but they're not interesting in the fact that none of these teams really seem like they can even challenge the Warriors. Like, now, if you're looking for the Warriors to have a tough battle in the West, the greatest chance is probably the Houston Rockets, but not guaranteed to be the Houston Rockets. So it's just like I don't know, man. I really don't know. I was hoping that somebody would emerge as something to just make it difficult for Golden State in the West and not make it an easy path. But instead, it seems like a bunch of flawed teams, albeit good teams, but flawed teams playing against each other. And I don't know necessarily just how interesting a lot of these matchups will be, or how invested people will get, because there's not much hindsight, or there's not much, sorry, not hindsight, there's not much to look forward to when it comes to the later rounds of the Western Conference playoffs, with all of these teams. Like, Portland, if Portland, the Clippers, the Jazz, the Thunder, the Spurs, if one of those teams advance, which obviously at least one of those teams will, if one of those teams advance in the first round, past the first round, like, are you really expecting them to do anything in the second round? Probably not. And so, I don't know, man. I think the West is a little less loaded than we thought it was going to be. And it would have been really interesting if the Lakers could have hung on for one of the 8 spots, because then all of a sudden you have LeBron versus all of these teams with question marks, and that would have been interesting. But we don't get that storyline, and that's that with the Western Conference. So I'm really wondering. I guess, some of the matchups I'm rooting for. I like to see Denver, San Antonio. I'd like to see that a lot. I'd like to see a first round matchup of the of the Rockets and the Clippers. I'd love Portland, Utah, and OKC, Golden State. That's kind of those are my ideal matchups, just because I love OKC versus Golden State in the first round. I don't think they're a contender now to beat Golden State like I thought they were a few weeks ago, but in Denver versus San Antonio just seems like the ultimate new team arriving versus a veteran, experienced team, and with Popovich, that would be interesting. And then the Rockets and the Clippers, you got the storyline of the last year, or sorry, not the last year, but of the last time they met, where the Clippers had that historic comeback against, or the Rockets had that historic comeback against the Clippers. Sorry, and what was just an absolutely insane playoff series. And then Portland and Utah would just be, Dame and Donovan going at it would be pretty fun. But I think Utah would advance in that one pretty easily. But you see what I mean? Like a lot of these have some interest to them, but not a lot, not a whole lot. I think by games 1 and 2 of each of those series, you'd have your answer as to who's going to win the series and who's the better team. I think that's really how a lot of those first round series would go, moving forward, or those first round series would go as the playoffs start. So, of course, with it being Sports Radio Detroit here, being based in Detroit, I got to close with some Piston talk. So I do want to talk about some Pistons. The Pistons have lost 3 games in a row now. They lost to the Trailblazers, then they lost to the Golden State Warriors. That was a back-to-back game. Both were on the road. And then they followed up with a loss against Denver. So should we be concerned that the Pistons lost 3 in a row? My answer to that is absolutely not. Those are 3 teams, and that was pre-Nurkic injury. Those are 3 teams that I consider to be better than the Pistons, no doubt in my mind. The Pistons actually, credit to them, they came back against Portland and made it a game, and they came back also against Denver as well, but they could not ultimately pull out the win. And the Pistons, with me, the real storyline is, so I'm not concerned that they lost 3 in a row, but of course, if you look at the standings, all of a sudden, which every Pistons fan's been refreshing that standings every night, it gets a little scarier because now Brooklyn's in the 6th and Detroit's in the 7th. I personally want Detroit to just be as high a seed, as high a record as possible. I don't really care who we face because I don't think we're getting out of the first round regardless of who we face. And to me, I just want the Pistons to be in the playoffs. That's all I want. So that being said, there was a little bit talk going into the Portland game. If the Pistons win out and Boston is struggling, maybe Pistons grab the 5th seed. That's over with. The Pistons would basically have to win out and Boston would have to lose out in order to grab the 5th seed. But that's not happening. Brooklyn has a tougher schedule, so I think the Pistons will end up ultimately finishing 6th. But that being said, I don't think it really matters too much on the Pistons' playoff chances. I don't think they stand a great chance against Philly or Toronto, regardless of what people want to hype up with the revenge tour with Dwayne Casey. I still don't think the Pistons would match up well enough against Toronto to win more than a game. Just like I wouldn't expect them to win more than a game versus the all-talented 76ers. The real thing with the Pistons, and this really hit me in the the Portland game, was Blake Griffin and just the wear and tear on his body. Like, Blake Griffin has been playing phenomenal. He's been carrying a heavy load for the Pistons all season long. He's been absolutely, no doubt, a lock All-NBA forward, which is something that is very crazy to basically consider that Blake is one of the 6 best forwards in the league. It would be crazy at the beginning of the year for a lot of people to say that. But, here he is. He's totally evolved. He's been shooting the 3 ball well all season. He's really just become a total complete player, and his ability to carry an offense is just far greater than even I expected it to be coming into this season. Like, I knew Blake was going to be Point Blake, and I knew all these things were going to happen, but Blake has just been absolutely phenomenal this year, and he has killed it for the Detroit Pistons. He has kept them afloat single-handedly, made the Pistons a relevant franchise again. So, of course, thank you, Blake Griffin, as a huge Pistons fan. But I'm really concerned about Blake's energy load or load management, since that's the new term that everybody loves to use. I'm concerned because I think there's nights where Blake just looks absolutely exhausted. He looks absolutely exhausted in that game against Portland, and it seems to be happening more frequently. So I'm wondering if the Pistons will rest him. They rested him against Cleveland. That backfired and they lost. And now with Miami Heat just being a half a game behind Detroit, the playoffs are far from a guarantee. They're far from a lock still for Detroit. So Detroit has to keep playing hard every night. But it sucks because we can see the wear on Blake Griffin as the games go on, as these last couple games move forward. So I'm really concerned about that going forward, and it's going to be something that we have to keep an eye on as Piston fans, because if Blake's even dinged up, I mean, this Piston team is just nowhere near what it is when Blake is healthy. Blake is that important, that vital to the team, that we need Blake at absolutely 100% if we're going to even win a game, let alone push a series in the first round. So that's something to watch out for. I'm really curious. I wonder if they're going to rest him. They got a couple games. They got a game against New York and a game against Memphis down the stretch. I'm wondering if Blake gets to rest one or both of those games, but we'll have to see how this next week plays out leading up to that. So once we kind of figure that out, once we see how that plays out, then I think when we get to those days, if the Pistons have a clear separation between seventh or sixth and seventh and eighth, then I think they'll definitely do it, and they'll be fine with resting Blake for a game or two here or there, and I think that could really help. But if the Pistons are still just a half a game ahead of Miami for the final playoff spot, and a half a game on the edge of the playoffs, then the Pistons are absolutely not resting Blake, and Blake is going to have to play. So that's something to keep an eye on. But all right, listen, everyone, this has been a great episode here on the Platte NBA Minute. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Platte. I want to thank you all for listening. Hope everyone is having a good week. Hope everybody enjoys their weekend. Hope I give them some food for thought when it comes to some NBA stuff. So please, if you don't already, please tweet me at RealChrisPlatte. Please tweet at Sports Radio Detroit as well. Let them know what you think of the podcast. Let them know what you think of my takes when it comes to the Nurkic injury, when it comes to the West playoffs, when it comes to the Pistons. I mean, shit, just throw me any NBA question and I will definitely respond. I love engaging and interacting with all of the listeners of this podcast. So please be sure to do that. That's at RealChrisPlatte, ChrisPlatte. Of course, you know how to spell real. So reach out to me there. And then, of course, Sports Radio Detroit. It's just Sports Radio Detroit. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. As always, I do the hip hop podcast as well. This week I did a long episode as I created a bracket. Long story short, I made a bracket. I spent 3 years making a hip hop bracket of all the greatest mixtapes and albums from each region: the South, the North, the East, and the West. And then I had them, and then I had them battle, and I made it into a podcast. But also, I made the bracket open for you guys to fill out as well. So if anybody would like to fill out that bracket, please go to my Twitter, once again, at RealChrisPlatte. Check that out. Or if you want, check out the podcast I did for Sports Radio Detroit, where I filled out my first round, the round of 64. Next weekend, I will go through the rest of it. It was getting long. It was about an hour runtime almost when it came to the first round of 64. So I decided to cut it into two, just to save the listeners time. I didn't want to bombard them with a 2-hour podcast. So that being said, I know nobody could stand to hear me talk for 2 hours. So that's why I'm keeping this one under a half an hour, as we are at the 29-minute mark. So that is my cue to get going. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week with some more hip-hop and NBA talk.
This has been an SRD production.
Hi, this is Jason Pinkett from Pucking Around and Spinning the Wheels on Sports Radio Detroit. Check us out every Sunday over on the SRD Hockey feed on Spotify, TuneIn Radio, Podbean, iTunes, and Stitcher. That's SRD Hockey in your search bar. New episodes every week.